Hello, welcome to our lecture on music and contagion. And I thought I would give you a different lecture than was normally scheduled. We were supposed to speak about music and identity, kind of revisiting that topic. But given the recent COVID-19 outbreak and some of the kind of extraordinary musical responses to it, I thought we should take a look historically and place everything in perspective for a new and maybe hopefully a topical lecture. The first thing I want to remember, though, is that the examples I've chosen for the music examples and even the diseases that I've chosen to kind of highlight in this lecture are really only just a few of the responses. The musical examples are just a few of the responses to disease, and really even the time periods and diseases I've chosen are really only a small samples of what has befallen the human race over the past many centuries. So I wouldn't take this as being a comprehensive type lecture, but rather I'm selecting out a few things that I feel like are interesting and are important to think about, and hopefully give us some context and some historical perspective on what's going on today in American society. So when we're talking about music and contagion or disease, we really have to go back to the big one, the Black Death and the bubonic plague in mid 14th century Europe. And this is really kind of a pivotal shift in European society. Really, anywhere between a quarter and half the population of Europe died from the bubonic plague. Medicine at the time was completely ineffective, and the population really had no idea how to deal with the plague. And as such, the response to the plague was really one of kind of pleading to God and the Virgin Mary and Saint Sebastian and others to really help, because there was no effective treatment, or people just didn't understand even where it was coming from for a long time. So during the mid 1300s, really, European society had all but collapsed. If you can imagine, one third to one half or so of the population dying, houses stood empty. No one was working. It was really a terrible time. And musically, what happened was a lot of the responses to this were kind of retrospective looks at the idea of disease and how to cure it. And in the 14th century European mind, that was really praying to God, praying to the Virgin Mary, and their musical output reflected this. So while maybe composers looked in that direction, the kind of general population had different responses to the Black Death. They either hold themselves up in their home if they could. They gave up. They just almost lost their minds and went crazy. Many people had really just kind of said, no, this is the end of the world. This is God's wrath, brought down on us. And so they threw kind of constant parties. And really, what this happened was people were drinking and singing and dancing and really kind of partying at the end of the world. And so some Europeans decided to repent for their sins. Some decided to carry lucky charms around them to try and ward off disease. Other people abandoned religion entirely and really kind of, again, were partying at the end of the world. And oftentimes this went along with people just taking over houses and throwing parties in them and singing and dancing and drinking all the wine left in the house, because so many places were left abandoned and empty because of the ravage of the disease. So as you can see, there were quite different responses to the bubonic plague culturally, musically, just because of the kind of lack of knowledge and also the kind of beliefs at the time. Musically, I think it's really interesting to look at. I will give you several examples here of kind of music that either was composed right around the time of the big surge in the bubonic plague in the mid 14th century, and a few other pieces that are more retrospective looks, or kind of looks back at the kind of effects of the plague and kind of incorporate some of that trauma into the music itself. The first one we should probably look at is by a composer named Guillaume de Machaut, and he's a French composer who did survive the kind of big push of the plague, and really he began to really explore new kind of secular music forms even before the plague started, and that kind of carried through into some of his work that was up until this point most musical output of Europe was very the stuff that we know now today that survived was very church-oriented, religious-oriented music. There were definitely secular forms back then too, and that's what people were oftentimes singing and partying to in those abandoned houses. But Machaut's work is a kind of a beautiful example of some of the response to the plague. And so by around 1365 or so, this piece I'll have you listen to, this is called a ballad form. That's kind of a secular verse poetry form. The ballad became really popular in Europe, and Machaut's piece here that I'll have you listen to is really one of the most beautiful pieces of music that came really kind of directly out of the plague. And so what I'll have you do is stop and listen to the first example linked on Canvas, and just listen through it and see what you think, and I'll come back and describe it a bit. So hopefully you enjoyed that Michaud's piece there. It's a ballad. It's much freer in form really than you would have heard in kind of earlier styles of music, but it's a great piece of polyphonic music that is kind of bridging the divide between sacred and secular. I want to take another listen to, I posted on another type of ballad that is popular, kind of popular sacred secular music of the time, and I want you to listen to that. That one's by Francesco Landini, and again, it's another type of secular music that was the type of thing you might have heard around the time of the plague. So after you've listened to that Landini ballate or ballad, I think you can also hear some of the parallels between the Guillaume de Machaut's piece. But again, it's more free. It's not this kind of rigid church mass music you might have heard earlier, and it's incorporating different languages. You're not just singing in Latin. So again, it's this kind of secular music you might have heard during the plague or immediately after that. And I've also included two other examples. One is a piece called Stella Celi by John Cook, and this is a mid-15th century English composer who's writing, really kind of recounting about the times of the Black Death, and I think it's another example of really some really beautiful music. I also posted on Canvas another piece by Guillaume Dufay, who's a 15th century Flemish Franco-Flemish composer. And again, these are both kind of retrospective looks at the years of the plague. They're incorporating some things that are important though. They're incorporating the Dufay piece is the piece titled O Sancte Sebastian is a piece to Saint Sebastian, kind of imploring him to help with the disease and help out the people of the Franco-Flemish region. And the other example I give you, the Stella Celi piece, is really a hymn that addresses the Virgin Mary and is, A, asking for help, but B, you can see in the text, and I'll give you a link to a really great blog post about this piece, but you can see in the text of it, it's really kind of, you can see the misunderstanding about the disease. It's really, they thought the disease or the plague came from the heavens, and again, you're seeing this kind of what at the time, the cultural understanding of what was going on. But I'll link both of those below. I just think just listen to those two pieces again. These are retrospective looks at and kind of incorporating some of the things that were learned or thought about during the plague. These are in 15th century pieces, the Dufay and the John Cook piece. But I think these are great examples of some of the kind of higher art music happening during the time of the Black Plague and afterwards. And hopefully you enjoyed them as well, just as a historical moment, really. I think what was really interesting to me is during this kind of recent COVID outbreak was all these pictures of people singing all throughout Europe, Spain, and Italy, and singing from their balconies while they're under a kind of lockdown or quarantine. And while it may seem like it's a kind of a spontaneous expression, and it is in that way in some respects, but it also have kind of long traditions. There's long traditions of people singing from doorways and balconies back again during the Black Plague times, and because they were unable to get together, they still needed a chance to connect. They still needed a chance to worship, and sometimes the church would actually have processions down the street during the Black Plague times, and people would come to their doorways and hear the singing, and then also be able to kind of participate in religious and cultural life, even though they were under quarantine. And so it was really neat to see that happening again in kind of contemporary Spain, Italy, and elsewhere. Nowadays, of course, it's not necessarily going to be these kind of religious songs necessarily. It's going to be pop music. It's going to be, I saw people putting on EDM concerts from their balcony. So you see a very different style of music, but that kind of collective action that is really important, I think, for the human condition, really, during this COVID-19 outbreak and during the plagues in Europe from centuries before. So jumping way ahead, I want to kind of skip over many different pandemics. We had yellow fever pandemics, all sorts of different diseases that happened in the intervening centuries. But I thought I should narrow in on the kind of more recent flu-like pandemic in the U.S. and talk about the kind of the influenza pandemic in the early 20th century and how that was reflected in American music. And so really the 1918 flu pandemic really killed millions of people throughout in the 20th century and was the topic of many pieces of popular music. We've actually heard or kind of encountered Blind Lemon Jefferson before, but I want to first start you off with a piece by Blind Willie Johnson, who's another blues artist, titled Jesus is Coming Soon. So pause the video and take a listen to that really shortly and come back. And I really like the way, if you listen to that, I like the way that his voice is almost reflective of a kind of a raspy pandemic or disease-ridden voice. But again, you see, even hundreds of years later, you see this similarity of where instead of kind of pleading to Jesus to save them, Jesus is coming soon is going to be, come and take your soul to heaven because of the disease. I see this kind of thread of religion and praying to God in times of pandemic. So Blind Willie Johnson's kind of grungy, kind of gospel sounding Jesus is coming soon really is about this kind of uncertainty and hopelessness that is kind of taken over America and the world too, where the flu pandemic is really ravaging a lot of people. The next example I'll have you listen to is Blind Lemon Jefferson. Again, we heard him before in one of our lectures on the blues. And his piece, The Pneumonia Blues, was written in 1929, was really, again, a retrospective look at the flu pandemic of 1918. But take a listen to that, and I'll come back and discuss it a bit. What I like about this piece by Lemon Jefferson is it's really kind of classic blues sound. His guitar is very classic blues, classic sound, and his voice is great in it. It's also kind of a very nice, powerful voice. And although ostensibly the piece is about the pneumonia blues, as his first lines, I'm aching all over, baby, believe I got the pneumonia this time. But it's actually really not about the pneumonia. It's not. It's really about a woman, going out and cheating on him. He's sings about slipping around corners and running up alleys, watching his woman to see where she's going to. And so it's really, again, this nice play, as we see in a lot of the blues songs. It's a play. The words mean multiple things. Multiple stories are being told with the lyrics, which is a really great example of that. So ostensibly, this is about the pneumonia or the flu pandemic. It's really about infidelity. So moving on from that, again, jumping way ahead into the future, I want to talk about another disease that really had a major impact on the arts and culture of the world, and especially America. It was the HIV/AIDS epidemic was really huge, had a huge impact on the entertainment industry. Many artists were lost, or they had lost close friends. Many artists used their star power to kind of advocate for the recognition of the disease and rally for a treatment into its cure. This is at a time really, especially the early 80s and a little bit later, where this disease was really attempted to be ignored by the political establishment. So it really took artists to push and to kind of speak up about it, to get recognition and trying to get funding for a treatment and research into the disease. So you have so many popular artists speaking about or singing about this disease. Elton John's The Last Song was written about a boy, Ryan White, who was a hemophiliac who contracted HIV through a transfusion and was then expelled from his middle school. Ryan White became the poster child for HIV and AIDS in the 1980s, mid 1980s. Cyndi Lauper wrote Blue Boy after a close friend passed away from AIDS. Bruce Springsteen wrote The Streets of Philadelphia. It was written for the movie Philadelphia that starred Tom Hanks and was really one of the first mainstream Hollywood productions to focus on and kind of portray HIV and AIDS in a kind of sensitive light. Annie Lennox repurposed Cole Porter's Every Time We Say Goodbye, and her later for her Every Time We Say Goodbye about kind of losing people to AIDS and HIV. Madonna's In This Life, what wrote about it was about her friend passing away from AIDS. So all of these pop stars were, part of the kind of cultural, artistic response to this disease in the 80s and 90s. Another example from the kind of the art world is John Corigliano's Symphony No. 1, and I've posted that below. And this is his kind of direct response. He dedicated it to the people that were lost to AIDS and about the scourge of HIV and AIDS in general. And so I posted that link to the Corigliano Symphony No. 1 down below, and you can take a listen to that in a second. And although these pieces of pop music and even Corigliano Symphony sound very different from the pieces I gave you from the 13th century Europe, I think you see some similarities too, right? There's a reaction to the disease itself. In the 13th century, we have these pleadings to God, to Mary, to Saint Sebastian to intercede, to help, and kind of bestow some sort of cure on the people who are ravaged by the Black Death. And really, in these more contemporary examples with HIV and AIDS, you see pop stars that were singing about what happened to them. So instead of the whole of Europe dying, this is their friends are dying, and so there you see this music is kind of inflected with themes of loss and rage and despair, and some actually in terms of hope and advocacy. And so, although the times are very different, the diseases are very different, what you're seeing is kind of, again, an artistic response to a certain pandemic type disease. In terms of HIV and AIDS, because in the beginning the disease was so disproportionately affecting the gay community, I think the musical advocacy done by these, mainstream pop stars really helped push the recognition of the disease and also the gay LGBTQ plus community into the mainstream, so to speak. When so many popular music stars were singing about this subject, this issue, it kind of, in a sense, pushed the LGBTQ plus community out of the closet, really. And I think the tone of this music created was really influenced by the disease. Again, the artists are singing about sadness, despair, loss, and then really many artists then turned that around and tried to use their music for the purpose of advocacy to try and generate funding for helping, um, generate funding for research into the disease and helping people who are affected by it. So again, I posted two examples for this slide section. The first one is John Coriano's Symphony No. 1, and the second one is Bruce Springsteen's The Streets of Philadelphia, which was again written for the movie Philadelphia. And two very different responses to the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Coriano's symphony is explicitly written about the epidemic, and if you can listen to it, you can see the very strong contrast in the music, a very jarring musical melodies, jarring switches of loud and soft and chord changes, etc. And it's very much reflective of that kind of shock and despair that AIDS caused so quickly through, especially the gay community in the United States. I think in contrast to Coriano's symphony, which is very jarring in a sense, Springsteen's The Streets of Philadelphia really is kind of more of a first-person account of the AIDS epidemic, or imagined first-person account. And as he goes through his lyrics saying, "I was bruised and battered, I couldn't tell what I felt. I was unrecognizable to myself. I saw my reflection in a window and didn't know my own face. Or, oh brother, are you going to leave me wasting away on the streets of Philadelphia?" It's really kind of a setting the listener inside the kind of inside the body of a person ravaged by AIDS. But it also, in a sense, it also doesn't address the topic head on, right? It didn't actually ever say anything directly about HIV/AIDS. It kind of broadens the appeal and maybe also broadens the imagery that can be used in the piece of music, and so it's not, it won't necessarily be, this wasn't pigeonholed as HIV/AIDS, although it was very associated with it. I think that kind of maybe vagueness about the lyrics maybe makes it more applicable to certain other people. It could be about the scourge of drugs in inner city U.S., etc. So it's another technique of kind of broadening the appeal of the piece of music. But again, there's a huge response to these, huge musical response to HIV/AIDS, and really didn't. If you were an artist at the time, you really everyone was affected by it in some way or another. And so I thought I should actually include something, a disease, a set of diseases that are not really pandemic, not contagion, they're not contagious necessarily, but I think it's really important to talk about the issue of mental illness in the music community. I know many of my students write about it in their papers and their ethnographies because it is such a prominent feature of especially contemporary musicians, but I thought we should look at a little kind of historical perspective of the idea of mental illness and its how it affects music, because it's kind of across the time periods, across all time periods, mental illness has been a feature of music and musicians' lives. So there was a recent study of independent musicians that it said that noted at least 73% of independent musicians struggle with mental illness. This was a study done with, I think 50, over 1,500 musicians, that depression and anxiety really were the top of the list of these kind of prevalent conditions, and panic attacks were also mentioned. If you look down the kind of history of musicians and composers, the number of people who are affected by this, by mental illness, is pretty astounding and consistent. And I put Beethoven up in your right-hand corner, probably suffering from bipolar depression and possibly alcohol abuse. The probably more recent examples I'm sure you've known, Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys, was very well known to be affected by schizoaffective disorder and bipolar. Syd Barrett from Pink Floyd, one of the kind of original band members of Pink Floyd, was probably schizophrenic and or bipolar, compounded by a pretty heavy drug use issue. We read in our article about Kurt Cobain. Again, he had bipolar disorder and sadly committed suicide as a result, most likely. Sinead O'Connor, well-known bipolar disorder. Demi Lovato, again bipolar, and again struggling with eating issues and drug addiction. And Kanye West also is probably bipolar, and and so the list is huge. I don't want to make the impression though that all musicians and all artists have some sort of mental illness. That really, I think, is very much up in the air. There have been a few studies done by people in the medical community and looking at the prevalence of mental illness in musicians and artists. And the studies that really are conflicting. So there's one study done in 2017 that showed that kind of the divergent thoughts, the kind of thoughts that we talked about in the previous lecture on kind of convergent and divergent creativity, but that divergent thoughts from mild to moderate mental illness really lead to some greater or increased creative capabilities. And this one professor of psychiatry argued that kind of wavering attention and the dreamy state of ADHD, for example, is really a source of highly original thinking. In contrast to this, there's other studies that show really the prevalence of mental illness in the artistic community might be not as much as you think. So there's another researcher who looked at the number of mentally ill creators who are successful are really pretty much dwarfed by the number of highly creative people who are successful as well. So that maybe prominent people who have suffered from mental illness, but there is also a huge list of people we don't think of who don't suffer from mental illness. So kind of parsing those out can be difficult. So I think before we go to the music examples, I just want to talk about the article that you read for this lecture a little bit. Hopefully I found like the analysis of Cobain's writings for Nirvana and his music was, I think, pretty enlightening in terms of how the use of performance and the idea of authenticity. This lecture, before I turned it into a Contagion in music lecture, I was thinking about talking about identity, and I think the article by Jessica Wood is a nice kind of almost straddles both topics. But I think the author of your article really details how Cobain and other punk bands use disdain, like intensity, unstudied musicality, and anger to demonstrate their, quote, authenticity. And I think the article also did a good job of showing how, although there was an emphasis on kind of unstudied musicality or kind of uncaring words or kind of a rejection of kind of the norms of normal society, but there actually was a lot of study and planning and thought that went into Cobain's writing of Nirvana songs, in terms of wordplay, in terms of the use of homophones to kind of morph the meanings of the songs, and the kind of different poetic approaches he uses to demonstrate the authenticity, or at least kind of perform a version of, quote, authenticity to the public. And so that's a really interesting article I think you should make sure you've read and also look at and think about before you listen to the example below from Nirvana. I think the idea of authenticity is a really interesting topic and a subject to think about, especially with other artists. And so I've given you several examples below. Jessica Wood's article talks about kind of the punk aesthetic and how they represent their authenticity on stage in terms of the kind of grunge sound. But how do the other artists I've listed below on Canvas site, how do they demonstrate their authenticity? How does Beethoven or Sinead O'Connor or Kanye demonstrate their authenticity? What do they include in their music to show the reality of, or the kind of their truthfulness to themselves? What traits do these artists demonstrate? I think there are some traits that are similar. Are there threads connecting the kind of quote authentic artist that seem to transcend time? That's a question you should think about. I think there are traits that great artists seem to typically display, intensity being one of those, and how that intensity comes out may be very different. And so in that respect, I want you to listen to the Beethoven Grosse Fuge, which I put linked there. And I think that's, before I even go listen to it, I think you're going to hear an intensity, a kind of almost uncaring convention that Beethoven he's kind of flaunting the kind of conventions of his time in this Grosse Fuge. It's confusing, it's difficult, it's challenging. And I think that's one way he's demonstrating his authenticity. It's another way that he may be an example of his issues. He was losing hearing, so he's kind of retreating into his own mind more, and he was doing pieces of music at the end of his life that were very complex and very different from what you'd hear from other composers at the time. There's that kind of intensity that I think you might find in the other examples I've listed as well. So pause for a second and listen to the Grosse Fuge, which is one of my favorite pieces of music ever. And then I give you a piece from the Takash Quartet. Again, I think they're one of the better quartets out there playing Beethoven and Bartok, etc. So take a second and listen to the Grosse Fuge performed by the Takash. So having listened to the Grosse Fuge now, I think you could hear that intensity, that complexity that Beethoven was getting across in his piece of music. Now I want you to listen to the Nirvana. This is the Hairspray Queen, which it was talked about in your article, and I think you should maybe go back and review some of the points she made about how Cobain is expressing his authenticity, or expressing his in a sense, expressing his mental illness about his body and etc. What is he doing that? How is he doing that artistically? How is he doing that lyrically in this piece of music? So pause for a second and jump many centuries ahead in time and listen to Nirvana's Hairspray Queen. So having listened to Nirvana's Hairspray Queen, I think you could hear that intensity. You can see the kind of homophonic wordplay that Cobain is doing throughout that. You can hear it. You can hear the kind of scream intensity. You can hear the kind of almost, it's not uncaring or unstudied, but the kind of jarring guitar lines, jarring switches in his voices. And again, this is kind of the way that Cobain and a lot of other kind of grunge punk artists demonstrated their kind of authenticity to the punk aesthetic. And so the last example I put in there it's very different from the others, but I think maybe there might be threads you can connect between these all. Kanye West kind of has had some documented mental breaks. He canceled his concerts very abruptly a few years back, and has really kind of made a big shift in his music over the last many years, and it's been speculated by others that this is due to some mental illness conditions. I think if you listen to this ultralight beam, it's very different in sounding than obviously Nirvana or Beethoven. But again, you have this, I think maybe there might be a little bit of this turning towards the idea of God that often happens with illness and disease, even not mental illness, but you see this happening in Kanye's work a lot, where his God has become much more of a prominent figure in his music, in his performances, in his his Sunday church services, etc. And so that might be some threads you could connect with this kind of illness theme we're going with today, and maybe not. But I would encourage you to listen to this ultralight beam, see what you think. When you get through with it, I think look at the number of lyricists, composers on this piece of music. I think there are around 10 or so, or quite a few number of lyricists. And so again, we always have to put this in perspective, right? This is not a piece of music written solely by one person. So it's hard to ascribe, especially if we're talking about mental illness, it's hard to ascribe that directly to this piece of music. You have to be very suspect of doing something like that. But again, this is a type of modern pop music that's composed by a lot of different people, and so you're going to have a lot of different inputs. Of course, Kanye probably has the final say on all this for his music. But again, you got to kind of break things apart and try to understand them in context. And so in the terms of the last three examples I've given you, Beethoven, the context is him kind of breaking the molds and the conventions of the time with his Grosse Fuge, which was almost unintelligible to some people at the time and not very well received by the public and the kind of artistic elite of the time. You see the kind of breaking of conventions with Kurt Cobain and the grunge punk aesthetic, kind of just the uncaring, unstudied kind of conventions. And you have it affects people in different ways, especially if you look at like examples of Kanye's music as well. So you have to understand all these kind of pieces of music in their cultural context, in their time context, who wrote them, the number of authors on the list of composers, etc. So you have to kind of put it all into context to try and understand it. And this brings us to the most recent crisis that we're undergoing right now. We're all locked at home and experiencing this COVID pandemic around the world. And what's the result? What's been happening because of this type of illness at this time? Unlike maybe the Black Death in Europe, we understand that this is very much a virus that's not necessarily God disapproving of us, although some people may believe that. But the COVID-19 is really affecting our society and our culture and our music in a very particular way. And I think it's important to maybe step back from the intensity and the reality of it right now and try and put it in some sort of historical and cultural context. And so there's been several results of the COVID virus already in the U.S. It's only been just a short amount of time. There's been a huge cancellation of live events, and that will continue on for quite some time now. There's been a rise in online or audience-less online performances or at-home concerts. Artists either performing in a concert hall without any audience members, or actually directly from their living room. We've lost quite a number of well-known, prominent artists to the virus, and these are generally older musicians, older visual artists, older theater playwrights, etc., chefs. There's been an enormous number of people who have been lost in this, very tragic to the COVID-19 virus. On the other side, there's been new forms of artistic output, and I think that's really somewhat encouraging, even though the times are somewhat bleak. And so I gave you a few different examples of these kind of effects of the virus on music and culture. And the first one I gave you is Trey Anastasio, who's the kind of lead guitarist from the band Fish. And he put out a little piece of music he's actually making an album but the piece I gave you is I Never Left Home. And I think this is him performing basically in his home studio. And this is an example of that kind of change in format, because due to the virus, music performance is changing in format. So take a listen to that and then think about that in terms of the context of what's happening. I gave you two more examples, again, of kind of new artistic output. And the first one is really kind of I find it more interesting rather than musical, but it's really the sounds of the COVID-19 virus. It's a genetic sequence, and then they translated that into sound itself. And I think if you listen to that second example of the COVID virus genetic sequence, it's kind of crazy what we can do nowadays in terms of mapping sound onto really anything. And I think it's an interesting sound of our times, really. And the third example I gave you is really a Ravel piece, an orchestral piece, National Orchestra of France, but they did it again through this kind of video conferencing technology where they had all the artists in their own homes putting together a really beautiful piece of music. And that's again another example of the new forms of artistic output. We have constraints on our movement and our ability to get together and play music and be together. And so this is an example of how we're adapting and we're changing the way we perform, the way we give music, put music out. Just recently, I was reading a few articles. Actually, I'm glad I'm doing this lecture now, because it seems like every day there's more and more coming about being published in the kind of mainstream media about music and or at least art and how the virus is impacting it. But I was reading a piece that kind of highlighted the importance of paying attention to language when we talk about different contagions. And it wrote about how Susan Sontag wrote actually in the 70s how the metaphoric use of language surrounding different illnesses says a lot about the cultural viewpoint of the people using that language. So plague, she wrote, was really seen as the kind of a biblical judgment on society. the AIDS epidemic was first seen as a disease of gay men and as a kind of as a punishment in some people's viewpoint. Today, mental illness is something a person suffers, although that wasn't always the case. So it was in the past, mental illness was seen as a failure of that person or their kind of moral failure, but now it's not seen as their moral failure so much, but it's something that they're suffering and they really have almost no control over. The COVID virus most recently has been described by xenophobes as the Wuhan flu or things like that, kind of, again, betraying their underlying cultural biases. And so I think when it's important when we're looking at music produced during this pandemic, it's really interesting and informative to carefully look at how language is used and try to analyze this in terms of connections, language and music and connections, and how that reflects the cultural viewpoint of the people producing it. And I wanted to ask you to think about it. That what are some other ways that musicians are using the COVID outbreak in their art? And so we have a few examples of that. We have the Trey Anastasio Stay at Home. We have a musical example of the virus genetic sequence itself. And I want you to maybe think about other ways that musicians are incorporating this kind of cultural and medical moment into their music itself. So as a final slide, I just want to kind of leave you of some of the kind of results and commonalities. And I've talked about these over the lecture itself, and so that none of these would be too much of a surprise to you. But there's been a loss of ticketed revenue, most recently because of no live events have been really scheduled for a month or so. This is really so central to the contemporary music industry. Really, if you see the kind of the death of the recording industry, and then everyone was relying on live ticket sales to make a living, and so it's been a really challenging time for musicians and performers. There's been a diversification in the way music is performed. There's been live stream music events. There have been kind of video conference events where people are doing things together. There are music being performed from doorways and balconies. I think in all of the examples I've given you, that there's been a preoccupation with the disease itself. And so you have in the 13th century or the 14th century Europe, you have this kind of preoccupation with disease and kind of divine intervention, and now we have a preoccupation of staying at home and keeping your social distance. There are songs directly about the contagion, or there's a preoccupation with say bodily functions in Nirvana's example, and that might be a result of the kind of mental illness that he was suffering through during that time. There's a banding together of musicians. There's kind of music is a social glue, and it's a way to bond and soothe things. And so oftentimes you see these benefit concerts to try and raise money for healthcare workers or grocery store workers or whatever it is. And there's just people singing from the balconies and the doorways again to try to keep that human social connection alive during a time when we can't be together as we normally have been. So I'd encourage you to observe like an ethnographer, do your participant observation, although participate at a distance, about how COVID and even the next big pandemic influences culture. Step back and try to understand how society reacts and how the musical creations that come out of times like these are really tied to culture, tied to the history, tied to the aesthetics, and they express the kind of desires of the cultures that birth them. Regarding our article we talked about today and you read for the lecture, regarding the discussion of music and authenticity, how does this issue of disease or pandemic influence the traits that artists hold up or demonstrate as being authentic? It's kind of maybe not the best phrased question, but I'm saying, is the hearts and prayers on Facebook a demonstration of authenticity? No. Is it creating content and giving it away like many artists have been doing? Maybe. So what do you think, how are artists responding to this current viral crisis? How are they expressing authenticity? How are they demonstrating their authentic engagement and their realness as artists and human beings? What are they doing to show that to you generally? So what else can you think of? I think we talked a lot about in this lecture. Hopefully you enjoyed some of the music, and thanks very much.